Amara balanced the heavy tray against her hip, weaving between glossy tables and couples laughing over candlelight. The restaurant shimmered with polished marble floors and gold accents that made her feel out of place in her borrowed uniform. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She didn't even belong in a place like this. Her best friend Miriam had begged her. "Please, Amara, just one shift. I'm sick, the manager will fire me if I don't show, and you used to waitress in college anyway. Just one night." So here she was, back in an apron, her hair tied in a neat bun, forcing a smile while her thoughts ran to the babysitter upstairs in their crumbling apartment, watching her 6-year-old son. The extra money would cover groceries, maybe even part of the electricity bill. That was reason enough. At table 6, near the wide glass windows overlooking the city lights, sat the kind of couple she always tried not to look at, beautiful, rich, and dripping with effortless confidence. Or so she thought. The woman, tall and immaculate in a red designer dress, talked in a high, carrying voice about her latest trip to Paris. "Honestly, business class isn't even worth it anymore. Private jet is the only way to travel. Don't you agree?" Her companion, a man in an immaculate charcoal suit, shifted uncomfortably. His features were striking, but his expression betrayed exhaustion. His jaw was strong, his hair perfectly styled, yet his eyes were distant, almost bored. He nodded politely, though it was clear he hadn't been listening. Amara poured water into their glasses, lowering her gaze out of habit. She noticed, though, the faint crease between his brows, the way his hand tapped absently against the tablecloth as though he was counting down the minutes. The woman caught him glancing at the clock and snapped, "Are you even paying attention to me? I've been telling you about my new villa in Santorini." "Yes," he murmured. His tone was clipped, formal. He reached for his wine, but his grip tightened slightly on the stem, as though holding back irritation. The conversation dragged on painfully, filled with her monologues about designer handbags and spa retreats. Amara's heart tugged with sympathy. Whoever this man was, he clearly didn't want to be there. She almost smiled when he excused himself to take a business call, though she doubted he'd actually picked up the phone. By dessert, the woman's annoyance spilled over. "This is pointless. You're clearly not impressed. I should have known. You don't look like the type who can keep up with me." She pushed back her chair with a dramatic scrape and stormed off, heels clacking against the marble floor. A hush fell over the surrounding tables. A few diners whispered, amused at the scene. The man sat still, shoulders taut, eyes fixed on the glass in front of him. For a moment, Amara thought he might prefer being invisible. When she approached, he looked up, catching her off guard with a surprisingly gentle smile. "Could you?" He hesitated, then chuckled softly. "Could you maybe just walk me out before someone else decides to watch me sulk? I'd like to leave with at least a little dignity." Amara blinked, unsure if he was joking. But something in his voice, a quiet, self-deprecating humor masking loneliness, pulled at her. Without thinking, she nodded. As he rose to his full height, buttoning his jacket, Amara realized this man didn't just seem important, he was. The aura of money and power clung to him, but there was something else too. A profound weariness, like he carried a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty on the inside. She didn't know yet that he was Daniel Hale, the city's most sought-after CEO. To her, he was just a tired man who needed rescuing. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she was willing to do it. The heavy doors of the restaurant swung shut behind them, muffling the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. Outside, the night stretched cool and quiet, a soft breeze carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the planters lining the street. The city's skyline glittered in the distance, but here on the cobblestone sidewalk, it felt strangely still, like the world had paused just for them. Amara hugged her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Her shift had ended the moment she handed in her apron, yet she still felt the weight of the day pressing on her. Standing beside the suited man, she was acutely aware of the contrast between them. He looked like he belonged in that glamorous world she had just stepped out of. She, on the other hand, looked like someone passing through, just grateful for the few extra bills the night's work would bring. "Thank you," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was smooth but quieter now, without the sharp edge she'd heard at the table. "I think you just saved me from becoming a sad headline. CEO abandoned in public meltdown." Amara blinked. CEO. He gave a lopsided smile, almost embarrassed. Sorry, habit. I'm Daniel. He extended his hand, formal, as though he couldn't quite switch off his polished persona. She hesitated but shook it. Amara. His grip was warm, steady. For a heartbeat, his gaze lingered on her, searching, as though her name meant more to him than she expected. She quickly let go, stuffing her hands into her cardigan pockets. So, she said, trying to ease the awkwardness, blind date. Daniel let out a soft laugh, the kind that sounded rusty, like he didn't use it often. You could tell. Amara arched a brow. She spent 20 minutes talking about villas and handbags. I figured no one would willingly sign up for that unless they'd been tricked into it. He chuckled again, a deeper sound this time, and the corners of his eyes softened. You're perceptive. I'm a waitress, she said lightly. We notice things. She didn't add single mothers notice even more, because they have no choice. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a weight she couldn't name. Daniel stood tall beside her, but his shoulders seemed less rigid now, his mask slipping in the dim light. Do you live nearby? He asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. For a second, she almost told him the truth, that she lived in a cramped apartment above a noisy street, where the plaster crumbled and the heater barely worked. But instinct made her wary. Men like him didn't understand women like her. Not far, she said vaguely. He nodded, not pressing. Instead, he looked out at the street, where a line of sleek cars waited for valet pickup. His car was among them, a glossy black vehicle that looked out of place parked next to the chipped curb. Amara shifted uncomfortably. She didn't belong here, standing next to him. She needed to get back home, back to reality. Checking her phone, she sighed. I should go. Early morning tomorrow. Something flickered across his face. Hesitation, maybe disappointment. He looked like a man used to people staying, used to controlling conversations, not watching them end. Yet he didn't stop her. Of course, he said softly. Then, after a beat, thank you, Amara, for treating me like a person tonight. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. She gave a small nod, then turned and walked into the night. Daniel watched her disappear into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the ordinary streets where chauffeurs never drove. For the first time in a long time, he wondered what it might feel like to trade his empire for the warmth of a stranger's smile. And Amara, as she hurried home to her son, tried to shake off the odd ache in her chest, the feeling that she had just crossed paths with someone who might matter. The grocery bags were heavier than Amara expected. She'd budgeted carefully, choosing only what she and her son needed for the week: bread, milk, a few vegetables, and the cheapest cut of chicken. But even so, the plastic handles dug into her palms as she climbed the cracked sidewalk toward their apartment building. Mama, I'm tired, little Yusuf complained, dragging his feet. His small hand tugged at hers, sticky from the candy he'd convinced her to buy with the last of her coins. I know, sweetheart, Amara said, shifting the bags so she could scoop him closer to her side. We're almost home. She was too focused on keeping the bags from tearing to notice the sleek black car that had rolled to a slow stop at the curb. It wasn't until the tinted window slid down that she looked up, and froze. Amara, her heart skipped. There he was, Daniel. The man from the restaurant, the one whose loneliness had left a strange mark on her. Tonight, in daylight, he looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man simply out of place in her world. Her son blinked at him, curiosity sparking in his wide brown eyes. Mama, who's that? Daniel's expression softened. He leaned slightly toward the window, voice gentle. Just a friend of your mama's. Amara flushed. Friend. She barely knew him. And yet, something in his tone made the word sound genuine. The car door opened, and before she could protest, Daniel stepped out, tall and perfectly tailored as ever. He glanced at the bulging bags in her arms, then at Yusuf tugging on her sleeve. Without hesitation, he reached for the groceries. Let me help. She shook her head quickly. No, you don't have to. But he'd already lifted the bags with ease, as if they weighed nothing. I insist. At least let me carry these to your door. Her cheeks burned. Neighbors were already peeking from balconies and doorways, whispering at the sight of a luxury car parked outside their worn-down flats. She hated the attention. Still, it was impossible to deny the relief of having her hands free to guide Yusuf up the steps. Inside, the narrow hallway smelled faintly of old paint and fried onions. Daniel followed without comment, his polished shoes clicking softly against the scuffed tiles. Amara fumbled for her keys, painfully aware of how out of place he looked, like a polished diamond dropped in a box of mismatched stones. "Sorry," she murmured as she pushed open the door to her small apartment. "It's not much." Daniel stepped inside, setting the groceries carefully on the chipped counter. He looked around, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. The walls were peeling, the furniture secondhand, but the room was filled with warmth. Yusuf's drawings taped to the fridge, the scent of simmering soup from a pot on the stove, a blanket folded neatly on the couch. "It's warm here," Daniel said finally, his voice low. Amara blinked. Of all the things he could have noticed, the flaws, the lack, the poverty, he had chosen warmth. Something in her chest tightened. Yusuf, ever fearless, climbed onto a chair and announced, "Mama makes the best chicken soup. Want some?" Amara gasped. "Yusuf, don't bother him." But Daniel smiled. "I'd like that." For the next half hour, he sat at her tiny kitchen table, listening as Yusuf chattered about school and superheroes. Amara kept busy ladling soup into bowls, trying to ignore the absurdity of it all. This powerful, untouchable man sitting in her cramped apartment as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When he finally rose to leave, Daniel didn't mention the peeling paint or the broken chair leg. He simply looked at Amara, his expression unreadable, and said, "Thank you for letting me in." And though she wanted to tell herself it was nothing, that he'd leave and forget this place, her heart whispered that something had shifted. The weeks that followed blurred into an unexpected rhythm. At first, Amara thought Daniel's visit had been a one-time courtesy. Men like him didn't linger in the lives of women like her. But then he showed up again. First with a stack of children's books for Yusuf, then with a new light bulb when he noticed one flickering in her hallway, then with an umbrella the night rain caught them at the bus stop. He never came empty-handed, but it wasn't wealth he brought, it was presence. He never flaunted, never boasted. He listened. He carried bags. He knelt on the floor to play toy cars with Yusuf. Slowly, impossibly, he slipped into the cracks of their daily life. Amara tried to resist. Each time she saw his sleek car pull up on their street, her stomach tightened. "You don't belong here," she told him once, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. But Daniel only smiled, leaning casually against the frame. "Then I'll stand here until I do." She hated how those words warmed her. One evening, he arrived just as she was wrestling with a broken chair leg. The chair wobbled dangerously, and she sat on the floor with a screwdriver, muttering under her breath. Yusuf had already given up, sprawling on the couch with his homework. Daniel knelt beside her without hesitation. "Let me," she frowned. "What do you know about fixing chairs?" "Enough to learn," he said simply. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms she tried not to notice, and together they tightened screws, replaced the worn hinge, and finally coaxed the chair back into sturdiness. When it stood straight again, Amara let out a small laugh. "Not bad for a CEO." He glanced at her sharply, surprised she knew. "You didn't think I'd notice eventually." She teased gently. "You're in the news every other week." For a moment, his usual composure faltered. His gaze dropped to the floor. "That's just a name, Amara. A title. It doesn't mean much." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She hesitated, then asked softly, "What does mean much, then?" The question hung in the air. Yusuf's pencil scratched faintly against his notebook in the background, the only sound in the small apartment. Daniel's shoulders sagged, as though the weight he carried had finally grown too heavy to hide. "I've been surrounded by people my whole life," he said quietly. "Employees, investors, so-called friends. 1,000 voices wanting something from me. But somehow, I've never felt seen." He lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time, the carefully polished armor was gone. "Not until you." Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to remind him of the gulf between them, her bills stacked on the counter, her worn-out shoes by the door, her life held together with stubbornness and string. But his gaze was steady, vulnerable. It wasn't pity in his eyes. It was something else. "Daniel," she began, but her voice faltered. He gave a small, almost boyish smile, as though embarrassed by his own honesty. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know." In the silence that followed, Amara realized how dangerous this was. Because for the first time in years, she felt the faint, terrifying flutter of hope, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry her world alone. And though she turned away, busying herself with Yusuf's books to hide the warmth rising in her cheeks, a part of her already knew, her life was no longer hers alone.